calling in from, and then to say a sentence or two about how you understand or experience reflection in your life or work. So 1 or 2 sentences after you say your name and where you're calling from. And so I am going to call on Perry to start us.
Okay, my name is Perry Sedman, and I'm calling from Miami Beach, Florida. And I find I was taught reflective listening in a number of contexts, and I find that when I use it when I'm kind of at a loss of how to respond to somebody. So if I don't understand what they're saying or I haven't quite gathered my thoughts, I will just paraphrase what I hear and kind of throw the ball back to the speaker. This is one-on-one conversations.
Thank you. Kim.
So I'm Kim Wright. I am in Burlington, North Carolina. And I think, is it just reflective listening or reflective inquiry that we're talking about?
Reflective inquiry.
Okay, because I'm always sort of questioning and reflecting on my work, my life, and with other people. You know, as a coach, I help people reflect a lot, and it's sort of the water I swim in.
Thank you. Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm in Boston. I teach at New England Law School, and I am not sure. I feel like I reflect all the time, but maybe there's a specific methodology that I am here to learn about. So I would say that I'm always reflecting, but maybe not the way I'll learn about today.
Thank you. Lyle.
Thank you. I'm Lyle Baker. I'm in the Boston area, Newton. I'm here because I'm on sabbatical working on both leadership and what we can do in law school to prevent suicide by lawyers after they graduate. So I have a feeling that reflective listening will be important, and I don't do enough of it. That's why I'm here.
Thank you.
And I'm gonna be on. I have an iPhone, and I have the choice of either hearing and or watching or you seeing me. So I'll have to put it down so I can take notes, but I'm not disappeared. I'm here. Thanks.
Herman.
Okay, I'm Herman. I'm from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I had about a 40-year business law practice, and now I'm working with the Earth Law Center and also the Center for Ecozoic Studies, and reflection is what I do. That's it.
Thank you. Amber.
Hi everyone, I'm Amber. I'm from Gibraltar. I'm speaking to you from Spain at the moment, and I think much like Kim described, actually, I think most of my life I've always been an extremely reflective person, always very interested in and invested in personal development, how I can grow as a person, as they say, as a spiritual, as a soul, you're like, experiencing a human body, and very interested as well, obviously, in my clients along the way, friends, family. So yeah, I've used it personally in my work as a holistic lawyer and also in community. Thank you.
Thank you. Rand.
Excuse me, can you hear me? My name is Rand. I'm calling from Philadelphia. And I've taught law school for many years. I'm retired now, and I look at what we had hoped to achieve, our generation, what we thought we were going to achieve, and I look at what we actually have, and I think I need to reflect on why we are in the situation we are now. That's just the beginning.
Thank you. Stu.
Hi, my name is Stu Webb, and I'm in Minneapolis. And I've been non-dual for about 8 years or so. And my reflection is love. I am love. And my reflection is love. I love you all. Over and out.
Thank you. Marjorie.
Hi, I'm Marjorie Silver. I'm in New York City. Yeah, I think I am a very reflective person. I teach reflection in my externship seminar. In fact, that was the topic for class on Monday. I won't be able to stay the whole time because I have to moderate a CLE, but I'm eager to hear what I've got time to hear.
Thank you. Donna.
Hi, Donna Cullen from Portland, Oregon. I think of myself as a contemplative lawyer. It's really important to me, and it's more about embodiment. And I just finished a year-long course in from the Nalanda Institute in New York on contemplative psychology and psychosocial change. I'm a lawyer. I'm frequently the only lawyer in the groups that I attend about this and the teachings. So this is really important to me, and I'm really glad to see that connection here. Thanks.
Thank you. Duncan.
So I'm currently on Route 128 driving my car around Boston. But I'm trained as a psychotherapist as well as a lawyer. My doctoral work was on mindfulness and the practice of therapy. So I'm kind of like Kim, that is, the reflective world is the water I swim in. And so I've been in the reflective contemplative world for most of my life.
Thank you. Judge Richardson. Is it Judge Richardson? Anyway, the Honorable.
How about Edwina? My name is Edwina Richardson, and I am a judicial leader here in New York State. Forgive me for being in transit, headed from New York City to Albany for our budget hearings. I aspire to be reflective in my work and in my personal life, and I'm just so grateful to be able to join this call today with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's everyone who's on the call. Did I miss anybody?
Me, Nanette.
Ah, yes, Nanette. Last and not least.
And then yourself, Anne. Yeah, I mean, I think reflection is, like many said, woven into the fabric of my life. But I also resonate with what Perry mentioned about reflection being interpersonal. So, you know, reflection comes most deeply to me, I think, when I'm trying to listen very clearly to someone else. Oh, and I'm here in New York City, and I'm delighted to be here with everyone.
And I'm Anne Friedman, and there's a lot that everybody has said that I want to connect with, but particularly I'm interested in the aspect of collective reflection and how collective reflection is an integrative version of that is related to but different from the conversations we usually have in classrooms. How if people are practicing self-reflection and supported in journaling and so on and mindfulness, they can join into collective reflection on issues and topics and relationships from a deeper place and have very different outcomes. So that's something I'm looking forward to in this conversation. And with that, turn it over to you, Michele.
Super. Well, thank you.
I'm the last one. I think I just came in.
Oh,
I'm
Greg.
Neil.
We're introducing ourselves by where we are and how we understand or use reflection.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll be brief. Greg Neal, I'm in Minneapolis. I am not a lawyer, although I'm a member of PISLAP, and it's in my blood. Our company is Center for Purposeful Leadership. We wrote a book called The Art of Convening. And so I'm here because this is what I do all day. Thank you. I'm convened.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone, and a special thank you to Nanette and Anne for supporting this presentation. And Anne has worked with me a fair bit on it to make sure that it was appropriate for our group. And I want to thank all the roundtable explanations of how people understand reflection. We can see how rich it is for those of us who do social justice work just by the sharing that's happened so far. And I think this topic, I agree, it's very timely, even though I live north of the border. It is absolutely essential that we have ways to find hope. And in my view, and in my practice, in my professional practice, as a social justice community lawyer, this is part of what sustains me, is developing the skills and capacity for reflective inquiry and practice. Thank you, everyone.
Michele, I forgot to say that
Yeah.
people are welcome to pose questions at the end, but also people can use the chat during this so that you can participate as we go along.
Super, thanks, Anne. And here is, this is an Australian beach, but with a Canadian quote. So this is how I feel about reflection. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And it's one thing that holds me during these darker times. I also want to begin by acknowledging the territory on which I'm grateful to live, learn, play, research, and write, and present as an uninvited guest on the traditional territory of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people here in the Kingston area of Ontario. In gratitude for this gift, I'm committed to answering the calls for truth and reconciliation with our First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people through how I carry out my scholarly work and engage others in building our individual and collective reflective capacities to recognize and right historical wrongs. I want to say a word about where I'm going with this presentation, because you probably have realized it's a two-part one. And so in this first one, I'm going to, the outcomes that I hope for today is that to start to develop some understanding of how PISLAP members have, how reflection has supported your work to date. I also would like to raise awareness of the critical contribution that reflection and reflective practice make to our learning and invigorating, sustaining our social justice work, obvious by the title. I'm hoping I might complexify how you understand a reflection. Many of you are very experienced reflective practitioners already, and integrative ones to boot. The reason for developing a conceptual framework is to try and map it out for people who are trying to encourage more of it in other people and to strengthen their own. And I'm hoping also to build awareness of the different methods, the reflective practices that we can engage in. And part of that will be by sharing some of my research, but part of it will also be, I'm hoping when we get to the second session, with a little bit more information from each of you about events, authors, and so on, that have inspired your reflection at certain points in your life. And next I'm going to talk about how I came to this work. So I'm just going to put that timer on again. There we go. Just give me a second for this one. There we go. And so I'm going to, how I came to this work, and hoping by reflecting on my own journey, it might help you reflect on yours. You might have some resonance there with what I've been through. I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by reflection and reflective practice. And I'll speak a bit about the benefits that have been discovered, why it's important to start it in law school, and how it supports our work after law school. And as I've mentioned, a little bit about the catalyst and methods, hoping that we'll do more sharing next time, and also that I can share some ideas that might be relevant to our group. And I'm hoping at the very end, when we do a check-in just before we leave, that you might share on anything, or during the question time that we've set aside after my presentation, that you'd like to learn more about, so that the second one can be geared to everyone's interests. So how I came to this, just a really brief one, because like many of you, I had to have a life behind me and one in front of me, but a fairly intense life behind me. And so there, when I think about the things that brought me to caring about reflection and reflective practice, I of course reflect on my work in social justice as a community lawyer and as a nonprofit executive director. And the always coming back to those first few days as a young lawyer, not really understanding what I was doing and realizing that I was not at all prepared for the kind of justice work I wanted to do through my legal education. And I wish I could say it was different now, but my own observations and in speaking with people during my interviews in Canada and Australia, I interviewed 53 legal educators about reflective practice. And I also audited some courses back here in Canada. I can see that the concerns are, at least in our country, still this close to the same as they were. There are lots of positive changes, but much more still needs to be done. So I was ill prepared for what is called the swampy lowlands of legal practice work. And it was so different from what Donald Schoen, who's considered to be the father of reflective practice, had to say about the academic high ground. And so I needed to be engaged in a multifaceted, holistic practice for poor people. And there was so much I did not know. At that time, we didn't even talk about ideas of legal empowerment. I certainly was disillusioned with the law as it operated sort of on the streets compared to how it was supposed to be operating on the books, at least in law school. And I had not been asked to think about my privilege when I was serving people who were living with some degree of disadvantage or inequality, and it was something I had to learn how to do. Speaking truth to power was another, and what that would take from me. And also just living out law as, for me, a vocational calling, not just a job, but something more that I wanted to do. So there were many paths that led to reflective practice, but I didn't understand that in the beginning. In fact, the first time I heard the expression reflective practice was in 2007 when I was taking a master's of adult education, of course. But I'll pedal back around the things that I now realize were all the threads that were connecting this. So I really was always concerned about how to create change in my workplace, in my community, and also in the law. So figuring out ways to do that, how to work through conflict, again, in my own office, with colleagues, with clients, in the community, with adversaries, needing to develop leadership skills to ensure that ideas could get translated into action, working within my community to bring understanding using participatory action research around issues like poverty and homelessness, pretty big issues, and then developing the skills to engage in systemic advocacy and law reform, to do community legal education, all skills and knowledge I did not possess when I left law school. And also, as time went on, a concern that we needed to become more efficient within Ontario's community legal clinic system in which I worked around how we were doing our work so that we could offer more access to justice and in more areas of law, and come to learn over time as I began to look into sort of work-based learning and organizational learning, that these skills, the capacity to do that and see the need for it, was very much connected to reflection. Again, that wasn't obvious to me when I started. Another really big concern I had was the need to work together on issues when we're so under-resourced, and my frustration working with our own funder, which was Legal Aid Ontario, and our inability to move into generative dialogue and being stuck with what can sometimes be a professional disadvantage, which is advocacy rather than inquiry, right? So being defensive about our points and advocating for our points without really listening to one another. So in that case, I became quite inspired by the work of, the workplace learning work and Senge's Fifth Discipline and Otto Scharmer's Theory U, social presencing technology work. It was all very helpful for me to move on. And I also was concerned about how we could see a future that was different than the one that we were in. That seemed to be a very difficult thing to do. So I became very interested in future forming research and visioning, and the idea concepts like how to create a justice ecosystem, for example. So I didn't have a name for what this underlying competency was, but I realize now that it was the capacity to engage in reflection and reflective practice. And I would have been influenced by people like Paulo Freire in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed book, by participatory action research techniques, as I mentioned, and a systemic advocacy course that I took at the YWCA, if you can believe it, that was really good on systemic injustice, but really transformative moment in my life. And also in Ontario's legal clinic system, we have community legal workers who are not trained as lawyers, obviously, and the perspective they brought into organizing was incredibly important for me to be able to move forward. And the Master of Adult Education, of course, was helpful. And I did some work with Shambhala Institute, if you've heard of them. Bill Torbert was doing work on action inquiry, if you've heard of him. That was very helpful. And I also took a couple of workshops with Otto Scharmer, including one in Boston, actually. And I was lucky enough to get a 6-month fellowship at a law school, Osgoode Hall Law School at York University, that gave me a bit of a breather from all the work I was doing to be able to look into some of these things in greater depth. And my master's research project was an early one around conceptualizing reflective practice, and I'll come to my findings there in a moment. And I also want to mention how transformative it was to work with Kim, for example. So Kim Wright came up and did some work with me on law as a healing profession back in the day, Kim. And also I was at the PISLAP conference in 2016 in Philadelphia and hosted by Susan Brooks, which were very important moments in my early work around reflective practice. But as time went on, there were all these very pragmatic concerns about becoming a better lawyer and a better executive director, better contributor. But the sort of the growing justice gaps and lack of equal justice have certainly been motivators for trying to figure out how can things be different than they are right now. And the OECD calls for people-centered justice because of the UN Sustainable Development Goal 16.3 on equal access to justice. Like, what are the competencies that we need to develop for lawyers to really be able to respond to what the world needs from us? And of course, we know, without getting into details, which I'm sure are pulling all of us down, just how overwhelming these tasks feel for us at the moment, given what appears to be our current reality in this world that we need to shift. And I became painfully aware, it was actually very difficult for me to read the literature critiquing legal education when I came back to it. And they say in your graduate work, you work through the trauma of earlier parts of your life. And for me, it probably was law school. But I became painfully aware of how far behind this is, just generally, because there's lots of wonderful law school examples that are different. And even in Canada, it's the same. Different law schools are doing different things, but how far behind we were in terms of understanding professionalism compared to other professionals, or what professional legal education really required, and a lack of appreciation for the role that reflection plays in learning, which just becomes more and more important all the time, and a real concern for our profession with an education that's too narrow for the roles and responsibilities we carry. So we need to have a greater capacity in ourselves to learn, which again brings us back to reflection and reflective practice and the need for a cultural shift in law. And in the Canadian context, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been a very important one for us in the calls to action for us to recognize the injustices done to First Nations communities and to respond in more culturally competent ways, et cetera, were a big motivator, and the growing crises in mental health and well-being. So on to what is reflection. So what I found it helpful to do after reading an awful lot of literature and interviewing people was to sort of break down the different domains of reflection that are important to us as professionals, not just legal professionals, but of course I developed this in the context of legal professionals. And I came down to that what it was really important was to think about what's the change we're seeking through reflection. And there are different things at different points in our personal and professional lives where these domains, as we call them, of reflection are important. It also sort of serves as a bit of a measurement tool, I guess, around, well, have I developed myself enough in this way, or have I supported my students, or is the law school supporting students in all these 5 ways? And if not, what can we do about it? I won't go into too much detail about them all because they are described in the handout for for this piece, but I'll come back to them in a moment. I also want to say where I've arrived at now. I found myself last year talking about reflective practice as a superpower. And I'm not a person who's into sort of hero stories and everything, but the superpower seemed to kind of capture, it was almost like the secret sauce, the underlying competencies of all other competencies. And I think it does support courageous work and leadership. And it does create a professional norm and expectation. And it is a meta competency. And I think it is a recipe for a cultural shift. And it's not just an instrumental way to improve practice, which really falls into the domain there of practice, reflection on practice, which is the original term that Donald Schoen used to describe how we take the theory that we learn in our professional schools and apply it in the swampy lowlands of practice. He described that as a tacit process that we engage in, but these days it's bigger than a tacit one. We have all kinds of methods for improving our practice in instrumental ways. But I think very important for those of us who care about social justice and the state of the world is the transformative impact of reflection, which I think comes through a combination of our critical reflection in so many different ways. Some of them are listed in your handout, but the idea of critical theories or disciplined knowledge from other places, feminist legal theory, there's just a whole multitude of different ways and philosophies of practice, which I'll come to in a moment, that can influence how we think about our practice, how we think about ourselves as practitioners, and the importance of integrating all of those so that we don't have a disconnect between what we say we're doing and what we are actually doing, our theory and what we're actually doing. And I think reflective practice is critical for how we actually embed our spirituality into our practice and how we reconcile or support political and justice work through law. What gives us the fire in the belly, I would say. There's more I could say on that, but I'm going to leave it at that. I want to say what it isn't, and I don't think anybody on this call thinks that, but I do come up against this in other contexts. It's not rumination, and it's not rationalization, and it's not regurgitation. I just think it's important to say that is really a deepening thing. When I first started this work, people would often think it was about navel gazing. I would hear a lot about that. And it's anything but that. It really is a disciplined practice, a systemic practice, the exercise of going through this. And we go through it at different points in our lives to different degrees, right? It's very highly varying. It's just these are the 5 components that I felt were important that lead to praxis, as you can see by this next slide, which has them integrating in ways that support our work better. And those of you who are around 2016 would have seen an earlier version of this particular diagram. So I think it's very much, again, about authenticity and professional integrity. And I think that description describes people who are members of PISLAP. So I want to say also briefly, talked about that. I'm just going to go back for a moment to talk about the benefits that I heard from the research. I'm only going to say it very quickly because I don't have too much time left. I very much heard from law professors about the same things I've been already saying, how important it was to strengthen students' capacity to learn, including from experience and including deeper learning than might be characteristic of their education. It's also about embodied learning and lifelong learning, also about improving the capacity to think, which becomes very important in the context of metacognition, creative and critical thinking, the ability to self-assess, all of that. Self-management is a big word in law schools these days, but particularly in Australia, particularly around mental health issues and well-being, and to foster agency and resilience, and also to be able to recognize the impact of emotions, of our emotions on our perceptions, on our judgments, our self-awareness, our relational skills, emotional intelligence. Again, it's the secret sauce that underlies all of this, the capacity to reflect. I've mentioned student health and well-being, a particularly big concern in Australia and a growing concern in Canada, and I know in the US also. And it's all, as I've already said, about how we develop professional knowledge and skills, how we get ready for practice, and also very much, as we'll know, about how we develop professional identity. Again, something was never talked about when I went to law school or even legal professionalism. And in my particular context, and what I heard from the people that I interviewed, was how it supports broader justice goals, including access to justice, and a term that I've called access to justice consciousness, and one that I've heard described in the American literature as a justice-seeking ethic. And I think also to prepare students, heard this very loudly, interesting enough, in Australia more so than Canada, about preparing students for an uncertain future. When I think about our practice now and the things that are important to me at this stage of my career, this may be something that resonates with you a little more than those early days of law school. But I do want to say we need to seed the ground for reflection in law school, or it becomes more difficult later, and we miss opportunities, and people miss opportunities themselves. So I think the call for trauma-informed lawyering, for cultural competency. We know now that training for negotiation, mediation, and all those forms of appropriate dispute resolution are strengthened by reflection, reflective practice. There's a fascinating book by Michael Lang, too, actually, on reflective practice in the context of conflict resolution work. I'm just going to take a little sip of honey water here. Excuse me for that. I'm just fighting this case of laryngitis. And I think about Nanette's work with holistic defense. And I think about all the multiplicities of philosophies and theories of practicing law by people who on this call have written about or had others write about and edited collections of their books, thinking about Kim and Marjorie in particular with that. And other things I've heard on this call about relational, progressive, rebellious, cause, contemplative lawyering, facilitative, client-centered, emancipatory, community, and then ideas of law as collaborative. Of course, we have here too, humanistic, integrative law. So much of this comes in restorative justice. So much of this comes from people who are involved in this very group. And the importance, I think, of all of us understanding that we do have a philosophy of practice, a practice theory, and that is something worth articulating as we model our reflective practice to others. I'm just going to say very briefly, this is just a chart here you'll see of the different methods of reflection that came through my interviews, and I've modified it a little bit. I'm not going to talk about them all today. We'll talk about this a little bit more next time in terms of methods. But I do want to point out, we've heard today about techniques about reflective writing, in terms of journaling being one aspect of reflective writing. And I think contemplative practices has been a very large one with this group also. And PISLAP itself, I think, serves as a catalyst for reflection on how things are, how law is, how we practice law, who we are as professionals and legal professionals for most of us. And I also find the role of critical or soul friends to be quite intriguing. So that might be something we could talk about more. And I think retreats are also highly valuable. And I know there just was a retreat for the PISLAP leaders. And I think that the work that Kim does is often very related to that. And action research will be something I want to talk about next time as a way that we manifest reflective practice in our work. And I think very much when I was sort of looking over and preparing for this, I was saying to Nanette, I look back at Peter Gabel's article on critical legal studies as a spiritual practice, as a very important piece that shows the integrative reflective practice aspect. And I think back to the forgiveness session and how meaningful that was, and the comment by one of the presenters about how we were made for these times. And also very impressed by the holistic law presentation, of course, and realized, of course, all the diverse ways that people were talking about in that call, or were writing about in Marjorie's book on transforming justice, are all the product of people who've been reflecting on their practice in critical ways and thinking about how practice needs to change. So again, I feel a little bit like Coles to Newcastle with this presentation when you think about everything that's happened with this group. And I just want to remind people of that. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. And there have been other ones that have been inspiring to me. I was looking at Kofi and Kessler's Reflective Counselor, a book today with its daily meditations for legal professionals. That's been out since 2008. And there are many other examples that I could go into, including Elaine Quinn's Conscious Lawyer magazine being an incredible contribution. And I know many of you have been inspired by Parker Palmer's work, The Courage to Teach. And even as not a teacher at the time I read it, I was incredibly inspired by that and continue to be. Yeah, and so thinking about integrating spirituality and law and politics, obviously that's what this this group is doing always. And I hope that my reflective practice conceptualization can help us think about how we can strengthen our own capacity for reflection, also that in others, and moving from our self-reflection to more outer reflection and back again. Yes. And I have to tell you the quote for today from the reflective counselor, it is a religious one. So for people that doesn't speak to, I apologize, from Micah 6:8. But it is the one about what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to live kindness, and to walk humbly with your God, which I think is a really, for me, has always been a motivational one. And I've been thinking recently, I'm going to talk about the earthworm theory of social change in just a second, but I've been reading a lot about spiritual warriorship as a way of coping with the news in the world, and what does that look like? What does that mean? And how that opposes itself to other ideas about lawyering, I suppose, that we might have, thinking like a lawyer or zealous advocate. What is it to be a spiritual warrior? Turn that off. Hopefully I've turned that off. Who knows what I've done just there. Yeah. And I also want to comment when I want to think about inspiring examples of reflective practice and who embodies it for me at the moment outside this group. And that was to read about the Episcopal Diocese Bishop Miriam Edgar Booty's witness after the election. I thought that was very moving. And I just want to comment on how reflective practice, to me, ties in with Ursula Franklin's earthworm theory of social change, which I have read in the original article now, but was first alerted to by Mary Jane Mossman, who's a Canadian legal educator, and her writing. So social change will not come to us like an avalanche down the mountain. Social change will come through seeds growing in well-prepared soil, and it is we, like the earthworms, who prepare the soil. We also seed thoughts and knowledge and concern. We realize there are no guarantees as to what will come up. Yet we do know that without the seeds and the prepared soil, nothing will grow at all. What is needed is a lot more earthworming, the preparation of the soil by individuals who are prepared to challenge the mainstream. And to me, my work on reflection feels very much like that. We're very much seeding the ground for the future. So we're going to move into a question. I'm going to leave it there. We're going to now move into sort of a question period that I think, Anne, you're facilitating.
And you're muted. You're muted, Anne.
Can you go to the slide that has the question on it?
Oh, those are the closing reflections.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The floor is open for questions and comments. Stu Webb has posted one in the chat, framing reflection as a subset of love, which recognizes that we're all beyond our bicameral brains, beyond dualistic thinking of both love and fear, war and peace, litigation and collaboration, but a more unitive state, which permits the most powerful kind of reflection. Lisa.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Stu, for that. Very, very true. Very much both and. So thank you for that.
So thank you for that. I need to watch the recording. There was so much in there that I wanted to unpack, but you gave me a lot to a lot of homework, because there's a lot to all your references I've jotted down very quickly. So thank you so much. Given this, so I'm in the US, with everything going on, and it's totally changed the way that I show up as a law professor, out of necessity of my own sanity, but also in service of my students, because I know that's what they needed. And so I started doing it a little bit in the fall in my torts class, but I'm teaching transitional justice this semester.
Right. Wow.
I just taught the Nuremberg trials, and so there's a lot of opportunity. And for the first time ever, I've been teaching for 15 years. I have been talking about mindfulness, and
Beautiful. Yeah.
I told them this is a part of the course. I'm going to do this with you. I've been practicing it kind of my whole life.
Yeah.
And I feel much more authentic as a person, but I feel really outside of my comfort zone. I feel very vulnerable and very outside of what I'm used to doing. But I'm glad that I'm doing it, and my students are really taking to it. And after the fall, I was kind of bracing myself. No one even mentioned it in my evaluations, but my evaluations were just off the charts, really good. So all of that shared, I have
Yeah.
actually a really concrete question thinking about my class tomorrow. So how do you teach the reflection that you're talking about? Like, what is it? So like, I think I know what it is, but maybe I don't. And did you get like a common, this is how you reflect? Like, how do you teach it to students, and what is it exactly?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I do think so. It's a reflective practice activity itself for legal educators to think about what is the change I'm trying to create in this day or in this course. Because I don't think you couldn't possibly hope to cover all of those, or maybe you could in a clinical legal education course where they were doing it full time or something. But it's like you have to choose. Am I trying to get them better at understanding how this theory applies in practice, right? So you're going to do something that has them reflect about that so they can understand how it would apply. Or you could be trying to do something that's getting them to critically reflect on something. So then, there's activities connected to that. My dissertation actually has like these curated ideas about how you create critical reflection, how you support collective reflection, how you support self-reflection, how you support reflection on practice. And the other one, I curated methods that people could use based on what I heard in interviews, based what I found in other professions, and based what was written about in law. You'll be surprised how much has been written in law, particularly in the US. Just nobody synthesized it. And I did an appendix that's about 25 pages that was just about trying to pull some of the threads together about what people have been saying for the last 40 years about this. One connection that hasn't been made very well I would say in Australia or the UK or the States, a little bit better maybe in Canada, but is critical reflection as an aspect of reflective practice and critically reflective practice, which for people who are justice practitioners is like, of course, that's what we're doing. We're trying to do all the time, but for some reason that people haven't connected it to ideas of reflective practice, whereas I have. And then I have this whole bunch where I call this critical reflection not so named, and I name a bunch of those authors, the people that are doing this but haven't called it that. So I'm not sure if that answers your question well enough. I think to think about what in your particular, and you have two different courses you were talking about, to me, you've already introduced a reflective practice activity in the contemplative practices, right? You're trying to create a space. There's something you're doing that's trying to create a space for those students. Maybe it's to be safe. Maybe it's to allow them to hear what's happening in that class. Maybe it's to allow them, so it has a greater objective than, anyway, to think about how what they're learning applies to practice, but by giving them the space to do that through contemplative practices, to me, that it's like you're doing it. That particular one. And then you probably have other examples, maybe of readings or problems that they're working on that would help with the critical reflection piece. I'm not sure what you're doing, but there probably would be. And happy to talk about it separate from this call too.
Oh yeah, no, that would be great. I mean, I guess I'm just thinking in terms of torts, it's the reflection on lack of access to justice, which is
Yes.
never taught in torts, and understanding the underlying social inequalities. So that would be getting them to reflect on those.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I know Jane Cheng, who has done her PhD dissertation on reflective practice in the context of post-law school in the UK, she writes about torts as the result of the reflective practice on contracts. Which is a really interesting way of thinking about it, right? Like it's so embedded, we don't realize it. And I don't think I've said this, but I meant to. Like we actually all do it, or most of us do it all the time. We just didn't have names for it. That's why I sort of took you through all the stuff I was doing, never realizing until I started taking that Master's of Adult Ed course where we had to do all this reflective practice work. We had to create a portfolio. And I said, well, what do you mean by a portfolio is one of our activities, right? And then realize now what a integrative reflective practice activity that is, because you have, and many of you have probably done it who are law professors for your promotions, right? You have to think about what your theory of practice is. You have to define it. You have to relate it to your work. It starts to create your professional identity, the exercise of work like that. And some people do portfolios in their courses, but very few. It's a huge endeavor, for sure. But it sounds to me like you're doing all kinds of things already.
Maybe.
No, you are. And the importance is of naming it so we can model it better, right? By real strengthening it. I think it's happening. I'm just trying to give it names that they use in other professions. Yeah.
So Lyle has a question.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm having trouble with the gadget, so I hope you can hear and see me. But,
oh, perfectly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Apologies. I have to put the phone down to take notes, but I'm trying to think about literally what I do differently in a class. Do I give students a journal entry and say, reflect on X, and give them some guidance of what reflection means as opposed to just write about it? I'm really interested in the work you did as an appendix of how you do this, because obviously it's one thing to think about the idea, but it's another to figure out literally what do I do in the classroom or as an assignment. And if you could give us any guidance along those lines, I'd be very grateful.
Well, the leadership area, of course, is one that's particularly rich in terms of reflection, right? There's so many examples, like from the Center for Creative Leadership, for example, about encouraging reflection in so many different ways. But for me, it comes down to in your particular, because you must be a particular course that you're teaching. Like in that particular course, how does it tie into your learning objectives for the course? What is what you need to strengthen that reflection will support? So I'll say that first and let you think about that, but then I'll also say about the reflective journaling. So people often conflate reflective practice with reflective journaling. And I keep saying, well, reflective journaling is a species of reflective writing. And it's one of these 15 methods or so that I've identified are important ones to cultivate reflection in law. It's really important. It says it in the literature, and I heard it from all the law professors, especially in the early days. If people haven't done a lot of reflecting in the context of journaling, a couple of things. Number one, you probably have to give some directive questions. So you embed reflective questioning in the reflective practice activity, which I think you've suggested. And the second is there has to be some safety around that if anything ends up in, at least I think so in the context of law school, that's my bias, around self-reflection. Because of the competitive nature of law schools, it cannot be safe for people, for other people to see their self-reflections and that kind of thing. So you do have to think about, your overall pedagogy and your goals in the course and how it ties in. And again, happy to also talk about it separately from this because it really helps me get better at explaining all of this, right? What strategy might work for you. And
so I just to follow on, and then I'll be quiet. But I think what I'm hearing is that it's helpful to have some prompts, and that the prompts produce usually a written comment, but you want to make sure that the comment is safe for the student to make. In other words, it goes to you and not necessarily to the whole class. But I guess the question of the nature of the prompt in a way that says, write about this issue in this way. I'm just trying to figure out what's different about this than just say comment on something, because there implies to me a piece of legal theory or at least practice behind this. If you could just elaborate a little bit on the nature of the prompt, that would be helpful.
Well, it would depend. Like, are you having them look at theories of leadership? Are you?
Well, in my class, I'm thinking about how to, and I'm working with the Center for Positive Leadership in Louisville, which works on theory of virtue-based leadership. So I can have them reflect.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah, but I guess the point is, if they're thinking about an event in advance, that's sort of planning, and then they reflect on what happened afterwards. And I'm just trying to get a sense of the difference that you're trying to describe. So I'm
that's a piece on it. Like they've observed something and then they're reflecting on it afterwards. So it builds their skill around observation and reflection on something that's happened. When you mention virtue, that piques my interest, because are there ways that you're trying to get them to reflect on particular virtues and how they might manifest in practice, or how they didn't manifest in some problem you saw, or however you're using it, right? That could be something else that you might be doing.
Yeah, that particular system of thought is that you try and plan in advance how you can be a little more virtuous than you thought you would have been otherwise.
Perfect. Yeah.
And, so, but.
Yeah, so then there's a descriptive, so then I don't know if you have something around the levels of reflection in a rubric or something that might show that you might just be simply descriptive about what you did, or you may be taking it, I'm sorry, to deeper levels, right? And critically reflecting on how you didn't do it, or, how you fell short, or developing a plan for the next time. Developing a plan for the next time is a really important part of the reflective cycle, right? So description of what happened, reflection on whether or not you met those goals, and then the plan for next time would be very much part of a reflective cycle around what you've just described. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's very helpful. I just want to get a sense of sort of how it works on the ground. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to being invisible so I can write. Thank you.
Sorry, again, happy to talk about it separately, Lyle. Yeah, it helps me. Helps me to do that. Yeah.
Michelle, I have a comment / question.
Okay, I'm gonna get a cough drop here.
Oh, please. I guess, well, first of all, I really appreciate your synthesis of all these different, there's so many different ways of reflecting, different paths of reflection that you sort of wove into one sort of into a unified I don't know, theory, I guess, or just looking. In other words, you broadened the sense of where we can get inspiration, reflective practice. So really appreciated that. I was thinking about Lisa's question regarding tort law, and I guess I had two comments. One is it feels to me like bringing the human dimension of what this felt like for the human beings involved in these cases is such an important way to bring reflective practice into teaching. And it's something Peter Gable spoke about quite a bit, when he was teaching contracts and really evoking the experience of the actual people. In fact, in one case, he used to describe actually contacting the people who were involved in a tort case, and somebody involved felt falling down a well, and hearing about their experience through an ancestor, and I'm sorry, through a descendant. And so I thought, that could be, that's I guess my question is, how bringing the human dimension, the life experience into teaching, could that be considered reflective practice? And then the other was, I was thinking about
very much so, I agree. Yes.
Yeah. You had talked about the contrast between advocating for points that we make and then listening to each other, and the two can be conflicting. And I was thinking about an experience I just had where I had represented a client in a impartial special education hearing, and challenging certain actions the Department of Education had failed to take, and it was a very adversarial hearing, and there were certain things that the people that were working with this student had done that were certainly worth acknowledging and appreciating, but in an adversarial context, that's not really your role. You're a zealous representative. Then flash forward, we had a post-hearing meeting today called an IEP meeting, where I was dealing with the very same people that I had cross-examined at the hearing. And now we're in a collaborative environment where we're talking about the student and trying to reflect on her progress, where she needs support. And it was a totally different kind of conversation where we were able to listen, and there was reflection involved. So it was really, noting, it was just a very powerful example of, is it possible to be reflective in the adversarial setting? And on the other hand, collaborative settings much more, lend themselves to it, but that's not always the legal system in which we operate. So anyway, those are a couple of thoughts I have.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And that, like, sometimes we do have to do the zealous advocacy to get us to a point where we can do the collaborative generative dialogue piece, because otherwise no one's listening to us, which is unfortunate, right? There's no right to be heard until you've overcome a certain obstacle and it's been opened up again for a hearing or discussion. Like, it's very much about strategy. I know in our own practice, we were always doing everything we could to avoid litigation. By having everything beforehand. I imagine the action research projects that we engaged in around poverty in particular, which now go back, oh gosh, a very long time, probably more than 30 years. And part of that was that the welfare office was engaged in all kinds of practices that were highly problematic and we felt illegal. But to do anything about those, we'd have to, take every case to what was at that point called the Social Assistance Review Board, like case after case. I thought, this is like super inefficient. So what else can we do? And then we ended up creating a task force on hunger that looked at all the different reasons why people might be hungry in our community and what was getting in the way. And it made a difference in terms of how that particular welfare office for that county was actually doing their work. It shifted things. We were one of the lowest numbers of appeals to the Social Assistance Review Board after we did that work with them. But it was systemic work, right? And different work. So we didn't quite take them on or embarrass them about how many hearings we had to go to. We just pointed out the impact of how different things happened and how they made a difference. It can be surprising. Of course, we don't always have the luxury of that, right? Sometimes you just got the case in front of you and you've got to get it to a place where somebody has to listen to you, which requires appeals and advocacy and so on. First, traditional.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I hope that I've answered that question.
Yes.
I'm going to put myself on mute while I'm listening if I can. How do I do that now?
Lisa.
I can mute
If
you.
no one else has another question, I just wanted to follow up on what Nanette said. So I guess what I'm trying to sort out is the difference between critical thinking, which, feels more like what we're doing with law, as opposed to the reflective critical thinking. And what I'm hearing is bringing in the human dimension, like learning the skills of listening, and it feels a little bit of connecting to kind of the systemic reasons for things. So in that example, Michele, that you're sharing, it's kind of like looking at the causes as opposed to just the symptoms of social injustice. So, I'm still in the place of trying to, this is probably the lawyer in me trying to nail it down and figure it out. And I know what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of different approaches. And so it seems like it's not just critical thinking about a doctrine and how it's applied, it's zooming out and getting more of the context to understand the larger human dimension and problems, and it's a justice oriented approach. Does that sound okay?
Oh, right. We have
You're
Michele
muted,
Yes.
Michele.
Sorry, I'm still coughing over here. This is bound to happen at some point. So it was interesting, one of the discussions, we had a lot of discussion in the context of my research about whether it was critical thinking in law or if it's critical reflection. And I had opposing views of people who said, no, critical thinking is what happens in law and critical reflection is maybe a subset of that. And then people who did the other way around to say critical reflection is what it's all about and critical thinking is one aspect of engaging in critical reflection, which is actually the school that I fall into. I very much see that the critical thinking is just part of the skill of being able to critically reflect on how the law operates, on whether justice has been done and so on. I'm not sure, does that help answer your question?
Yes, I think that makes sense.
Okay. But there are people who feel differently about it, right? Because people very much in law are very rational and head, right? So it's all about thinking and not about reflection. And oh my God, embodied reflection. Are we going to start doing that now? What's that going to be like? That's a topic for another day. So we're now, I don't know if there's any more comments or questions, Anne, you want to bring forward, but it's now time for the closing reflection.
Yeah. So I'm really glad we're going to have another opportunity to, I hope many of us will be able to come back for the second part because I think we can have some really fruitful conversations. And the question we're asking for anybody who would like to share, what is new or surprising about anything that you heard? And what else would you like to learn about or share about in the next call? So I'm going to say that this helped me unpack some of my assumptions because I I think it comes naturally to me to do it, but I'm not being as analytical. So actually my critical reflection has been enhanced. And one of the things that I would like to talk about the next time is how getting law students to be giving them permission to be in touch with their feelings and their reactions to things and get comfortable with bringing that into the law school classroom and into their own practice is a important component to making it the distinction between critical thinking and critical reflection actionable. So I want to talk more about that. Other folks?
I can add that I am surprised that I can't figure this out exactly as I want to. You know, why am I so worried about nailing it down? You know, that's a little bit of a interesting feeling that that's the lawyer in me, right? And that's what students will do. They'll want to understand, like, what is this you're teaching me and how does it work? But I think what would be really helpful, especially for those of us maybe in the US, although I think it's global, is I feel much more comfortable doing this in a class where I know everybody's on the same page. So the students that show up to my human rights classes, I'm assuming we're all on the same page. But in my torts class, I had a range of students, some of them who voted for Trump, and I felt very nervous about navigating these conversations. And I think I must have pulled it off because, like I said in my evaluations, nobody dinged me. But it's pretty nerve-wracking. And so getting some guidance on how to do these reflections in mixed political settings, I think would be really helpful.
Is this a class that you had introduced the mindfulness meditation into?
Gosh, no.
Okay.
This is the one that was torts. So torts, I did a human rights reflection on everything going on. And the day after the election, I did it, and then I did it towards the end. I did a lot of social justice teaching, but not full focus. In transitional justice, I'm doing full on, you know, Chicken Little and the sky is falling. Let's breathe about it. I'm much more open about my views. So, but that's because I know the students there are on the same page.
Perry, did you want to make a comment?
Yes. For me personally, theory is great. I would love in the next session, if possible, that we could see how this works in practice. That you could use the group here to reflect and respond to a prompt or two that you may put out. That's the way I think, for me, I would learn best how this works.
Thank you.
Duncan.
So I'm finally at home. I think my background in psychotherapy and teaching psychotherapy for many years has affected how I think about reflection or how I reflect on reflection. But in particular, I'd like to follow up on what Nanette was saying and maybe what Anne was saying about the maybe the distinction between critical thinking, reflective thinking, and my human response to what's going on. So in the language that I use, it would be something like, how does that land in you? Or what happens inside you when you hear that? Things like that. And lawyers are not particularly used to doing that. So when I work with lawyers, it takes a while to say, no, I'm really interested in your inner life. I'm interested in what happens inside you. So I'm really curious about that conversation between critical thinking and this internal experience.
Yeah, because it's very much the domain of self-reflection, right? That's where you're in there looking at your values and your ethics and your emotions and all of that, right? And I'm being told it's not a very safe thing to do within the law school environment unless you're in a safe classroom where people think similarly. And we're not going to, well, anyway, hopefully eventually that might change if we can listen to one another better, but it is certainly a challenge. But yeah, so I'll keep that in mind too.
Amber.
Michelle, there's a message in the chat.
Yeah, sorry, I can't really see them.
Amber.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Michelle. I'm going to follow up with what Perry just said, and ask whether what I'd like to learn more about is how you would approach a lawyer-client conversation about reflection on what's happened to them, why they're in the conflict they're in, or why they're in the litigation, and in terms of maybe looking for them to reflect on accountability. And for me, what's more powerful and more important even than that is the transformative power of inviting a client to reflect on their role in the conflict, because that can be quite transformative for them. So at least that's what I found in my litigation practice when I was litigating. So I don't know whether that might be something you could offer at the next session. What
Yeah, I
would
can
that
think about how to do that. I mean, anyway, I can think about how we might do that, or what skills I might bring to that. Remember that my work was largely for the dissertation was at the law school level, right? And creating a conceptual framework and getting people apprised of what educational theory is very much part of that in terms of understanding how we might create change. But I have some ideas for sure.
Because when I did
people's needs are so different, right? About why they need reflection to support their work, even in this call.
But I think it's really core for the skills
Yeah.
side of legal education, like when they're learning about the client conference, for example. And if you could integrate into legal education, teaching students how they can invite their clients into this reflective space when they're in the client conference, which is what I've been doing in practice as with my holistic approach, I think that would be extremely powerful and transformative for them. And also, it's given me more meaning and more purpose and more, I suppose, a feeling of like satisfaction in my profession, that I'm actually seeing that it's not just drafting documents and getting somebody's divorce through the law courts. It's actually asking the questions gently, not with no judgment. Like, why do you think that you fell into this abusive relationship? Why do you think you stayed in this relationship for so long? But obviously gently, and so on and so forth. Just to share very quickly, one of the most powerful testimonials I had, which was from a lady who was in a very violent relationship and whose divorce I took on a number of years back now. She told me that without my holistic approach, she literally would not be here today because her thoughts was suicidal. And what that brought me to was this reflection of, if I had just treated her strictly within the confines of an adversarial approach, I would have sat her down, I would have got her name, telephone number, address, number of kids, dates of birth, all the facts. Drafted the documents up for her, made sure, I filed them all, because in Gibraltar it's a fused profession. So we do the solicitor and barrister role in one. And then, fair enough, great. I would have accomplished what most lawyers do when they get their drafting done correctly, which isn't rocket science. And she would have had a decree nisi, then her absolute, and Bob's your uncle, maybe a contact order and maintenance, and so on. Well, of what use would any of that been if weeks later should have taken her life?
Well, exactly. You know what? It strikes me that when you actually know what the solution is to this because you've done it, but in terms of me presenting on it, when I think you've already come up with a technique by the way you've described it, but you also have a particular philosophy of practice. So what you're saying is, I am not buying into that zealous advocacy that I was taught in law school that looks like it's this big. I am involved in more holistic lawyering. In fact, it's client-centered, and I care about what's going on in my client's life. And what kind of support do they need to solve the problems that they're having? And you're doing the active listening and reflective listening that we heard about earlier in the call. You're very much doing that to situate what is it that you can best help the client with.
And imagine if I had been taught that at law school, instead of having to literally, as you said earlier, I think that one of the things you said, which is really powerful and resonated with me, was speak truth to power. speaking
Yeah.
truth to power in an adversarial system, which is very patriarchal, at least in Gibraltar, it is, very pyramid structure,
Yeah.
hierarchy, very male dominant at the top, has been a disaster, which was why I ended up stepping out and setting up my own thing. I was called altruistic. Do you think this is a charity when, when you're sending clients off for counseling, instead of, signing them up, with retainer letter and deposit paid up? So there's been a lot of challenges, but anyway, I don't want to take more of your time, but I'm fascinated by what you're doing, and what I would like to do is to learn more from you, because obviously I've created this on the go, if you like, in my practice.
You're totally engaged in reflective practice. Like you totally said, this way of doing it doesn't work. I need to find, it's exactly what I went through. Like, this is not the right move right now. Like something needs to be different than it is right now. And you must have gone off and seen things or read things or whatever it is that you did, talk to people, what you went through a whole process yourself, which is it is a reflective practice activity. There's a number of different things that you did that I would actually encourage you to reflect on between now and then, because I think you're going to come up with the answers about what needs to be done, because you did it.
So I want to stop
Thank you so much.
this dialogue between you, as fascinating as it is, because I want to bring in a couple of things, which is that Stu made a comment that all of these teaching issues would be best approached from a state of loving consciousness toward all of one's students, and that will facilitate this. And Edwina is very interested as a judicial leader in New York State's access to justice work. She's very interested in settings outside the classroom and the courtroom, so in practice and in other settings. And Duncan is interested in how to bring his own experience of reflective practice and offer it to in law training. And now Rand has his hand up.
In my hand?
Yes.
No, thank you. I don't know how to put my electronic hand up. But I found this conversation very, very interesting, and thank everybody for their contributions. And I just want to mention that when I was graduating from law school in the late 60s, early 70s, we were reinventing public interest law at that point. And Ralph Nader and all kinds of people were running around doing things. And there was a fascinating sort of dance going on where lawyers, even the left-leaning law teachers and lawyers, wanted there to be some kind of what you might call not highly politicized version of how to raise all these issues in something that felt more comfortable and professionalized. And there was a fascinating back and forth, to and fro, which actually had its roots back in the legal realist crisis of the early 20th century, and Holmes and Pound and all these people. So there was Carl Llewellyn, huge struggles going on jurisprudentially and also about how to teach. And I actually wrote a student note on this topic in which I predicted the rise of critical legal studies and the rise of some highly very different conservative viewpoint, which I regret to say has come to pass. So I'm very, I understand the impulse. I want to be part of it, and there's just a long history here that I'll be glad to fill in if you're interested.
No, super interested, because it's all that creativity, right, that comes from this, and the agony that people bring to that task that then results in them needing to make a change, right, and to work for change. And I think people outside law, I know that's hard for us to understand who are in the middle of law, but it's hard for people to understand outside law that we have such a critically reflective component to what it is that we do as legal professionals, because it's not how we're seen. In community anyway, I can say that. It's not, people don't even understand that piece of it. Or if you talk to people in other disciplines, they don't always appreciate that, right? Because anyway. I think it's a really strong point. I just like to see it more integrated in how we actually practice, because I get a little bit disillusioned about critical legal theories, back to the point about theories, that can't actually be implemented in practice, because we never actually talk about how you do that, because there's a disconnect between the academic high ground and the swampy lowlands of practice, right? So what Parker Palmer would call a tragic gap. He uses that word in a different context that I like to use for this, like the critically reflective stuff that happens when you're in law school and how you cannot manifest it in practice for all kinds of reasons. Some of which I think Amber talked about too, right? That just people don't understand what you're talking about, and that's not the way they think law should be practiced. So I hope that's helpful. I know that we're out of time. We're past time by a few minutes, but I really appreciate all the sharing that people have done, and happy to connect with people outside of today's one to prepare for the next one, because again, I'm only gonna have 20 or 25 minutes to do anything. So I've got some thoughts, but anyway, we'll see. Anne and I will talk about it a bit more, and I think I see I got an email from Amber there, so that's helpful. And yeah, so happy to deliberate with you on all of these. I don't want to sound like I'm the only person who could have the answers, because I'm not. Most of you have already the answers within you, and I'm really excited about Duncan's offer about wanting to do more in that particular area that he's described. I think it'll be really important work, right? And Lisa, I understand your angst about all of this, because the theory sometimes can confuse people. It's a lot of information all at once. I sat with this stuff for probably 2 years before I could actually see that particular way of understanding reflection being connected to the change that we created. In fact, it probably took me right into my dissertation. In the next one, I'll also mention other ways that people have developed for understanding reflective practice. There's about 5 or 6 other themes. This is my particular bent, the change we're trying to create, but there's other ways about thinking about reflective practice, for example, I'll talk about next time.
So I want to invite us all to take a couple of easy, deep breaths together. This has been rich and complicated, and I want to acknowledge that we have a lot of energy in our shared inquiry space, and I want to encourage us to take our energy back out of the shared space and out of each other's spaces, so that we have all the energy we need for whatever we're going to do the rest of today and the rest of this week. Nanette, when is the next call?
Yes, the next call is Tuesday, March 4th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So that's the part 2 with Michele, and much appreciation, Michele and Anne. Thank you both. And also, just to give another preview on dates, Herman Green, who joined us today, will also be speaking about Earth Law on April 7th. So just to give you a preview to put that on your calendars. But March 4th at 1 p.m. Eastern for us, and we'll send around an announcement and Zoom link.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye all.